Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northfield. My name is Martha Easter Wells, and I've been a member here for 2.5 years. UUFN is an inclusive community that nurtures spiritual and intellectual growth and fosters ethical and social responsibility. If you are a visitor, either on site or online, we are glad you are with us, and we invite you to stay after the service to get acquainted. We welcome your questions and look forward to getting to know you. Later in the service today, we will take our Share the Plate offering as a way to care for the wider world. For this month, our Share the Plate recipient is the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, PCRF. The world looks on in horror as the humanitarian crisis continues to unfold in Palestine. We join our resources together this month at UUFN to help children and families there. PCRF is the primary humanitarian organization in Palestine, delivering crucial and life-saving medical relief and humanitarian aid where it is needed most. We direct our June Share the Plate donations to their Gaza Relief and Recovery Program, which provides emergency medical care in their new field hospital in Rafah, infant nutrition, clean water and safe food for families, and trauma counseling for children in Gaza. This is one way we care for the wider world. There will be instructions on the screen during the offertory for giving with cash, check, or electronically. You may give from our website if you have your phone with you. During the offering later, you may put cash or a check in the basket or donate online from our website, uunorthfield.org. There will also be instructions on the screen during the offertory time. I call your attention to the announcements in your order of service and weekly email. There you'll find more information about the following. Save the date. On next Friday, June 21st, we will have a summer solstice celebration at UUFN at 5 p.m., followed by supper together at Culver's Restaurant. Join us next Sunday for June 23rd for the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly Worship, Weaving Our Lives. We are all tangled up together in the great web of life that is woven with beauty and hardship, love and loss, thriving and struggle. How do we tend well to the weaving so that all of us are held in care? Gather at UUFN to watch this service as congregations across the continent gather to do the same. Delegates will have voted on the proposed Article 2 changes that weekend, so we'll announce the results of that vote. Notice this service is recorded and is 1 hour and 15 minutes long, slightly longer than a regular service, but much shorter than last year's 2.5 hour, 2+ hour GA worship. Again, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northfield. The flaming chalice is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. Each Sunday when we gather, we bring this symbol of life together. Please join me in speaking the words for the lighting of the chalice. Let us open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Let us open our minds to learn what is true. Let us open our hearts to love one another.
Our call to worship this morning is the poem Delivered, a Blessing by Jan Richardson. Jan is a Methodist minister, a writer, an artist, and the image on the cover of your order of service is an image that goes with the poem. From the 100 wants that tug at us, from the 1,000 voices that hound us, from every fear that haunts us, from each confusion that inhabits us, from what comes to divide, to destroy, from what disturbs and does not let us rest. Deliver us, source of all, and draw us into your relentless peace. Come, let us worship together. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and sing our opening hymn, number 209.
Let us move into our time of centering and connection. Spirit of life and of love, draw near. Help us to become more aware of your presence shimmering within and among us. Will you take a breath with me? In the presence of a love that holds us all, we use our chalice flame to light our candles of community. We light our first candle as a blessing for the wider world. In a world facing the increasing challenges of severe weather events, let us remember that resilience and unity can light the way even through the darkest storms. By embracing sustainable practices, investing in innovative solutions, and fostering a spirit of global cooperation, we can mitigate the impacts of climate change and forge a path toward a safer, more harmonious future for all. Let hope be our guide as we strive to protect our planet and its people. We know, too, that the details of our daily lives are sacred and important. We now light a candle for all the simple joys that are sustaining us. And we light another candle in honor of the sorrows and hardships we might be carrying. Into a time of silence, may the truth of your heart be reflected in these flames. I invite you to settle into a silence of your understanding, holding the truth of our lives and the world in our hearts. Amen, and blessed be. Excuse me. Our reading today is Kalama Sutta, to the Kalamas. Thus I have heard. Once Gautama, the Buddha, was wandering and came to a town of the Kalama people called Kesaputta. They had heard of his fine reputation, and so they said, Gautama the Buddha is a great teacher, self-awakened and perfect in knowledge and conduct. He explains the spiritual life both in its particulars and in its essence. So let us go see him and see what he has to say. So the Kalamas went to see the Buddha, and they said, Lord, whenever spiritual teachers come here, they say their teachings are correct and they criticize the teachings of others. And then other spiritual teachers come and they say that they are right and denounce the other teachers. They leave us so confused and uncertain. Can you tell us which teachers are speaking the truth and which ones are lying? The Buddha replied, Of course you are confused and uncertain. That seems like a reasonable response to so many conflicting views. What I recommend to you is that you go not just by reports, by traditions, by scripture, by inference, by analogies, by logic and reason, by probability, or by something simply because you have heard it from a respected teacher. But examine things for yourselves. And if you find them to be unskillful, blameworthy, criticized by the wise, and leading to harm and suffering when they are put into practice, then you should abandon them. What do you think, Kalamas? When greed, hatred, or delusion arises in a person, does it cause well-being or harm? It causes harm, Lord, they replied. Yes, and if you think about it, you can see that the presence of greed, hatred, or delusion leads to such things as people taking life, stealing, committing adultery, and telling lies, and then they encourage others to do likewise. What do you think? Do these things lead to harm or well-being, suffering or happiness? Harm and suffering, they said. So it is, the Buddha replied. And when you know that, something leads to harm and suffering, then you should abandon it. Similarly, when you examine things for yourselves and find that they are skillful, blameless, praised by the wise, and lead to well-being and happiness when they are put into practice, then you should adopt them and keep practicing them. What do you think, Calamas? If one can be free from greed, hatred, and delusion, does that result in harm or well-being? It results in well-being, they said. Yes, the Buddha continued, I think you will find that when someone can be free of greed, hatred, and delusion, they can cultivate such things as compassion, generosity, and equanimity. Then people do not act in ways such as taking life, stealing, committing adultery, and telling lies, and encouraging others to do the same. What do you think? Will such behavior lead to harm or well-being, suffering or happiness? Well-being and happiness, they said. So it is, the Buddha replied. And when you know something leads to welfare and happiness, then you should adopt it and practice it. When they heard these words, the Kalamas rejoiced and praised the Buddha for his teaching, which uncovered what was concealed, pointed the way for those who are lost, and carried a light into darkness. Thus was it said. We now expand our circle of care as we gratefully give and receive our Share the Plate offering for the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Sharing these gifts is one way we make our care for the world tangible. Will the ushers please come forward? Today, we welcome Lisa Ebert to our pulpit. Lisa Ebert lives in an old house in Northfield where she cares for her dog, makes art, restores antiques, works with wood, and writes. She holds MDiv and STM degrees from Yale University and did her doctoral work in Christian theology at Emory University. She has completed the Integrated Study and Practice program at the Barr Center for Buddhist Studies, participated in several retreats at the Insight Meditation Society, and has maintained a Buddhist meditation practice for 20 years. Thank you, Lisa. Welcome.
Good morning. It's a true pleasure and privilege to be speaking with you here this morning. As I was working on what I was going to say, I kept having that persistent argument with the autocorrect. It involved the word kalama. Some of you have problems with autocorrect too, I can tell you. It involved this word kalama, which refers to the ethnic group to which this teaching was presented, and it's spelled K-A-L-A-M-A. And I kept typing it in, and every time I typed it in, the autocorrect would try to replace it with Kalamazoo. So I corrected the autocorrect repeatedly, which was both frustrating and funny. And for me, it was especially poignant and even funnier since I was actually born in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So me and the Sutta are just meant to be together. When I first talked to Susan and Susie about this service, it was several weeks ago. And back then, I had no idea that Reverend Sarah's sermon for this flower ceremony would involve the Buddha's lotus sermon, or that Reverend Terry Berner would talk so passionately about gardening, the transformative power of compost, and use the traditional Buddhist image of a lotus rising out of the mud. As Sarah said last week, noting those synchronicities, because the universe is awesome, we have even more synchronicities today, as I come with another Buddhist teaching and yet more gardening metaphors. So I hope this can be a worthy chapter in a trilogy of Buddhist-infused springtime meditations on flowers and weeds, muck and transformation, and the work that's involved as we look for truth and meaning. Back in February, as someone new to the UUFN and the Unitarian Universalist tradition, but also as someone very familiar with church history and polity, I decided to attend the Saturday morning discussions and listening sessions that focused on the proposed changes to Article 2 of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the same changes that will be voted on later this week as the UUA holds its General Assembly. One of the things I remember most about the Unitarian Universalist principles is the fourth of the traditional 7 principles, which is reused verbatim in the proposed principle on pluralism. In both cases, it promotes a, quote, free and responsible search for truth and meaning, end quote. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. That really resonated with me. And I'm sure that principle also resonates with many of you as well, and it's at least partially why you are a part of this community, much less sitting here on a very warm Sunday morning. I am also pretty certain that many of you find, as I often do, that this search for truth and meaning isn't easy or straightforward. Sometimes it's just downright confusing and frustrating. There's all that baggage and stuff you bring with you from whatever spiritual tradition or lack of tradition you grew up with. Maybe you encountered some other traditions through friends or relatives, or like I did in a college course on world religions. There are many religious traditions to explore, and then there are even more variations, sects, teachers, and preachers within each of those traditions. Just here in Northfield, there are around 20 churches and religious groups that you could join and attend. Plus, in our modern world, there are so many voices vying for our attention and purporting to be the way we can find truth and meaning in our life. Bookstores and libraries have shelves full of self-help books and religious texts. And then there's the countless web pages, videos, and even apps for your phone that offer some kind of spiritual advice. And the Buddha said, "Of course you are confused and uncertain. That seems like a reasonable response to all of these conflicting voices." The Buddha said something to that effect while visiting a small rural community and talking to a gathering of folks interested in the search for truth and meaning. This was about 2,500 years ago in northern India, close to what is now the border between India and Nepal. And still, despite all of that time and distance, despite all of that human progress, here we are, still confused and uncertain. Perhaps even more confused and uncertain, and we're still asking the same sort of questions that the Kalama asked the Buddha way back when. Can you tell us which teachers are speaking the truth and which ones are lying? Now, given how timeless and universal the confusion and questioning seem to be, I'd like to suggest that it's also worth looking at how the Buddha responds to the kalamas. Now, the Buddha doesn't answer by describing who or what to believe is true. In fact, he says that the source of a teaching or a practice doesn't really matter much. And he lists pretty much every way which we might encounter or learn something, and then discounts its importance. Let's just briefly go over this list. He says that we shouldn't go by reports. That is, what your friend told you, or what you read online, or what you heard on NPR, things like that. Nor should you go by traditions, family traditions, religious traditions, that sense that things just should have always been this way. Nope, none of that counts all by itself. The same goes for scripture, which is really just a written tradition. But according to the Buddha, scripture by itself is not to be trusted. And I will note this also goes for the teaching that Martha read for us earlier. Then the Buddha lists more of those things that we think of as modern, or if not scientific, ways of getting information and looking for the truth. He mentions logical conjecture, inference, analogies, logic, reason, and probabilities. Nope, none of those are good enough by themselves. And finally, he says you shouldn't go by something simply because you have heard it from a respected teacher. If you think of the ways that you learn something, that's a fairly comprehensive list. And I think the Buddha is getting at, what I think the Buddha is getting at here is not that we constantly need to question whether whatever we read or hear is factual, or even if it's worthwhile. NPR can usually be trusted for the news. Science is good at explaining things. And Reverend Sarah is a very good teacher. Because no particular source is entirely adequate, the source of our truth can be almost anything. An ancient text, or a new podcast episode, a scientific discovery, or a lucid dream. To echo the UU principles, this is the free part of our search. But it is by no means a free-for-all where anything goes. Whenever we encounter a tradition or text, a gifted educator, or a deep personal realization, we just can't take it at face value. Instead, the Buddha instructs us to do some work, examine it, put it into practice, and then observe what happens. We can't know what is true or what isn't true until we see the results. Truth becomes whatever we believe and put into practice that leads us to become more compassionate and generous beings. Whatever provides a way of increasing well-being and happiness, not only for ourselves, but for our community, the wider world, or as Buddhists like to say, for all beings. In this way, the truth can't be limited to a particular text or tradition or practice. It can't be summarized in some statement of faith, much less put on a t-shirt or a fridge magnet. What's true is what makes you a better person. What provides positive results, or in short, what works. As I was contemplating this recently, some deep recess of my memory thought it sounded kind of like another ancient teaching that was also given amongst fields and hills to those in search of truth and meaning. Beware of false prophets. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? So every sound tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears evil fruit. A sound tree cannot bear evil fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. These are the word of Jesus. These are the words of Jesus. As recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, and almost identical teachings also appear in the Gospel of Luke and the apocryphal, that is not included in the Bible, Gospel of Thomas. While Jesus still tells us that we can know what's true by looking at the results, he conveniently puts it into an agricultural context we can really understand. Our search for truth and meaning is a hard one, and we will know what things are true by their fruits. So when you consider a particular teaching or practice, here's the test for whether it's true. Does it lead to well-being and happiness? Does it bear good fruit? Does it work? Moreover, this sort of examination is the responsible part of our search for truth and meaning. It ensures that we are not engaged with something for the wrong reasons, but pushes us to work for a more compassionate, inclusive, generous, healthy, and just world. Now, just to be clear about what's involved here, I'd like to suggest a few ways that we can work with this in our lives and in our spiritual practice. We don't have to go around always searching for new methods or ideas, as long as what we have is working. We can often relax and ease back into what is familiar, safe, and comfortable, as long as it serves us and leads to well-being and happiness. There's nothing wrong with what works and what's comfortable, provided that after some thought and examination, we find it really is actually useful and helpful. In that way, it's like an old sweatshirt or a favorite pair of shoes. My favorite shoes are Birkenstocks, and I've been wearing them for over 30 years, and more than half the shoes I have in my closet are Birkenstocks. They work. I'm a believer. Podiatrists say they're good for my feet. I find they contribute to my well-being and happiness, so there's no need for me to reconsider my shoe choices. I'm wearing them now, and I'm pretty certain that when I die, or at least when I'm cremated, I will be wearing a pair of Birkenstocks. In a similar way, I still have many remnants and souvenirs from my past spiritual exploration that I find meaningful, skillful, and useful. So while I can't abide much for what passes as Christianity these days, I still love the teachings of Jesus, as well as some of the lessons I've learned along the way from theologians and philosophers. I find that these are all familiar, comfortable, and worth having around. I'm sure all of you have some collection that's similar, be it a small basket or a whole closet full of principles, beliefs, traditions, and practices that just work for you on your own search for truth and meaning in life. According to this teaching, we can keep those things that are familiar and comfortable as long as they are useful and produce good fruit. That is, as long as they are helpful, skillful, and lead to well-being and happiness. Not only can we keep them, we are called to hang on to them, cherish them, keep them close, use them regularly. At the same time, the Buddha's instructions give us permission to let go of whatever things that we were taught, those things we think we should believe, and those things that everyone around us keeps saying we must accept. In fact, this teaching doesn't just allow us to set them aside, it requires us to evaluate them, see if they're useful, and then abandon them if they aren't working. I will note that this means we might have to let go of some of those things we like or have grown accustomed to, and those things that have just become so comfy and familiar. But just like old sweatshirts and shoes, as time wears on, some of our favorite thoughts or beliefs just stop serving us. in a useful way. Even as we are examining our long-held beliefs, this teaching also allows us to be open to new ideas and traditions. Don't be dismissive of something just because it's strange, different, or outside your comfort zone. But we must always be mindful of whether these new teachings or traditions measure up to our principle of a free and responsible search. Do they cause harm or promote well-being? Does it lead to suffering or move us closer to well-being and happiness? Or to return to the metaphor of cultivation, we are free to pull out the weeds from our spiritual, intellectual, or communal gardens. In fact, if we're to have a fruitful garden, getting rid of the rot and intruders is exactly what we need to do. I still remember discussing my yard with a master gardener years ago, and she gave me one of the most useful pieces of advice that I've heard about gardening and life in general. We were looking at an area where some perennials were encroaching on a nearby bed. I was uncertain about what to do as I really liked the perennials, and I was considering just letting them be and take over. She looked at the garden, then she looked at me, and she said, "Well, you just have to remember, a weed is any plant that isn't where you want it." A weed is any plant. No matter how tenacious or beautiful, how delicate or prolific, it doesn't matter if it's been there for years or just sprouted up this spring. While inspiration can come up anywhere, a weed can be any plant. You see, no matter how much you like it, how much it's helped you in the past, or how much it meant to your grandmother, those aren't good enough reasons to hang on to them. Similarly, we can't keep what's new and exciting or bright and attractive or the latest trend if those things cause harm to ourselves or to others. If it is causing harm and suffering, it needs to go. So take it out, put it in the compost pile. And I don't need to say anything more about compost other than to refer you back to last week's sermon. As you can tell, Buddhist practice is one of the ways I find truth and meaning in my life. And I can truly say that it has been perhaps the greatest contributor to my well-being and happiness over the past 20 years. But it took quite some time and a considerable struggle to be finally fully receptive to this practice and its teachings. Between the time I first heard a Dharma talk that changed the way I looked at things, it took 5 years before I was able to go back and get rid of my attachment to some of the certain texts, traditions, and teachers that I loved and decide I wanted to hear more. Then it took another few years before I finally committed and then started really digging in to the Buddhist tradition. And here I want to reiterate the message from one of the TikTok videos we saw a few weeks ago when Sarah spoke about pluralism. That video begins with the Reverend Joanne Fontaine Crawford saying, "Please don't graze at the buffet table of pluralism." Pursuing a free and responsible search for truth and meaning can't be casual or superficial. The process the Buddha outlines involves work and time, just like a garden. You can't plant a grapevine and then expect to be eating grapes within a few weeks. Identifying weeds and pulling them up by the roots takes energy and persistence, and all of this takes a certain amount of time and dedication. Finally, I'd like to point out that sometimes what works may not be what you were taught or expected. In fact, it may be something you don't like at first, find uncomfortable, or think is just plain silly. But if it works, it's worth considering and maybe pursuing. This principle calls us to use whatever teachings and practices encourage well-being and happiness. And sometimes the source of that good fruit can be rather surprising. If you're like me, sometimes you'll find that what really works is also what doesn't make sense to you at first, or ever, or that you couldn't have imagined thinking or practicing these kind of things 5 or 10 years ago. That's okay. To close, I have one final note about Buddhist practice and our search for truth and meaning in our lives. When we think about Buddhist practitioners, we often think of folks sitting very still in silence, often looking very peaceful with crossed legs. And we think of them meditating in a way that seems almost detached or apart from the world, rather than being fully rooted in it. This misunderstanding, like so many other historic misunderstandings, can be traced back to colonialism. Back in the 19th century, as England was busy expanding its empire into India and the Far East, it encountered a population practicing very different religious traditions than the Anglo-Catholic tradition with which they were familiar. There were Hindus, Sikh, Taoists, Jains, Confucians, and of course, many Buddhists. And so religious scholars were sent over to decipher and describe all of these new and very different traditions. As you might anticipate, almost all of these religious scholars were Anglican priests. These priests studied Buddhism, visited monasteries, and saw serene monks sitting silently for long periods of time. They understood that this was a core religious practice of Buddhism, and at first likened it to a kind of prayer. Then they realized that the point of the monk's practice wasn't to commune or communicate with some divine figure, but more a kind of internal contemplation or reflection. And so sifting through their bags of words about how you label things in religious contexts, they called this sitting practice meditation. And we have been stuck with that description of Buddhist practice and similar practices in other Eastern traditions ever since. Now, the original language of the earliest Buddhist scriptures, such as our earlier reading, is what's known as Pali. The word used in these texts for the practice we call meditation is bhavana. And in Pali, bhavana definitely does not mean sitting quietly and being detached from the world. It literally means to bring into being, but is most often used to denote a kind of purposeful development, or yes, cultivation. Glenn Wallace, an American scholar who studies Buddhist scriptures and the Pali language, describes bhavana this way. Imagine that when Gautama, the Buddha, chose this word to talk about meditation, he had in mind the ubiquitous farms and fields of his native India. Unlike our words meditation and contemplation, Gautama's term is musty, rich, and verdant. It smells of the earth. The commonness of this chosen term suggests naturalness, everydayness, ordinariness. The term also suggests hope. No matter how fallow it has become or damaged it may be, a field can always be cultivated, endlessly enhanced, enriched, developed, and produce a favorable and nourishing harvest. Here in this place of farms and fields, as we search for truth and meaning, may we do the work of rooting out harm and suffering and cultivating well-being and happiness for ourselves and for the wider world. Let us work together to help produce a favorable and nourishing harvest. May it be so. Blessed be. I now invite you to rise in body or spirit and sing together our closing hymn, number 300, with in mind. We close with a reading that's numbered 699 in the hymnal. These are the words of Paul the Apostle, or St. Paul, the namesake of our state capital. Paul writes these words from Rome, where he is under house arrest. He is awaiting his trial and inevitable execution by the Roman authorities. So here he is near the end of his life, sending a letter or an epistle to his friends in Philippi, a coastal village in eastern Greece, several hundred miles away. And this is what Paul tells them. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable. If there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think on these things. Keep on doing those things that you have learned and received, and the God of peace will be with you. May it be so.
We join in the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please rise in body or spirit, and with your hands over your heart, holding a hand of those next to you, or whatever posture is most comfortable for you, we sing the words of blessing one to another. Go in peace.
We were sort of confused about everything, but. Wonderful. That was so good. What would next do? I heard about it. Yeah, maybe. Everything's great. So.